So use extra, extra virgin olive oil. It's 100% pure, like me.
What if I told you that somewhere in a vault, there's a complete TV episode that was so shocking, so controversial, that a major network decided to bury it forever? Not just cancel it or edit it down, but actually pretend it never existed. For over 30 years, one episode of Married with Children was locked away like a dangerous secret. Fans heard whispers about this mysterious lost episode, but nobody could prove it was real. It became the holy grail of banned television, a ghost story that seemed too crazy to be true, but was real, and now, after decades of silence, it's finally coming back. Picture this scene. You're a TV writer in 1989, and you just finished creating what you think is another typical episode of one of America's most outrageous sitcoms. The cast films it, the crew wraps production, and everyone goes home thinking they made just another day's work. Then suddenly, network executives see the finished product and panic. Phone calls are made behind closed doors. Meetings happen in secret, and within days, your episode disappears completely, as if it never existed at all. This isn't science fiction or urban legend. This actually happened to an episode called I'll See You in Court, and the story behind why it was banned is more fascinating than the episode itself. What made this particular half-hour television so dangerous that it couldn't be shown in the 1990s? Why did it cross a line that even Married with Children, a show famous for breaking every rule, wouldn't dare to cross? And why is it suddenly safe to watch now, in 2025? To understand this story, we need to go back to a time when television was completely different from what we know today. In the late 1980s, American TV was dominated by squeaky clean family comedies that painted perfect pictures of suburban life. Shows like Full House, The Cosby Show, and Family Ties showed us loving families where parents were wise, children were adorable, and every problem could be solved in exactly 22 minutes, not counting commercials. These shows followed a simple formula that audiences had grown used to over the decades. Families might face small challenges or minor disagreements, but everything always worked out perfectly by the end. Dad would give a heartfelt speech about the importance of honesty. Mom would offer gentle guidance with a warm smile. The kids would learn valuable lessons about friendship, responsibility, or being kind to others. There were soft piano music moments during emotional scenes, and every episode ended with hugs and laughter. This formula had worked successfully for years, but by the late 80s, something was changing. Many viewers were starting to get tired of all this perfection. Real families weren't like the ones they saw on television. Real parents argued about money and struggled with their jobs. Real marriages had problems that couldn't be fixed with a single conversation. Real teenagers were often selfish, moody, and difficult to deal with. People wanted to see something on TV that felt more honest about what family life was actually like, even if that honesty wasn't always pretty or uplifting. That's when Married with Children exploded onto television screens and completely shattered every expectation people had about family sitcoms. This show premiered in 1987 on Fox, which was still a brand new television network trying to compete with the three major networks that had dominated TV for decades. Fox needed something bold and different to get people's attention, and Married with Children was exactly what they were looking for. The show gave audiences the Bundy family, and they were unlike anything anyone had ever seen on television before. Al Bundy was a complete opposite of every TV dad who came before him. He wasn't wise, patient, or understanding. Instead, he was angry, bitter, and frustrated with every aspect of his life. He worked as a shoe salesman in a mall, a job that he absolutely hated and that barely paid enough to support his family. Every single day, he came home exhausted and miserable, constantly complaining about rude customers, his terrible boss, and how unfair life had been to him. Al's only source of pride was his high school football career, when he had once scored 4 touchdowns in a single game for Polk High School. That brief moment of glory from decades ago was the only good thing that had ever happened to him, and he brought it up in almost every conversation. He would tell anyone who would listen about that one perfect game, as if reliving could somehow make up for everything that had gone wrong in his life since then. His wife, Peg, was equally far from the typical television housewife that audiences were used to seeing. She had bright red hair piled high on her head, wore tight clothes and high heels around the house, and had absolutely no interest in traditional domestic duties. She never cooked meals for the family, which meant they lived on takeout food and frozen dinners. She never cleaned the house, so their home was always messy and chaotic. Instead of taking care of household chores, Peg spent her entire day lounging on the couch, watching television, eating bonbons, and shopping for expensive clothes and shoes that the family couldn't afford. Her favorite hobby was tormenting Al, especially when he was trying to relax after a long day at his horrible job. She would demand attention, ask for money they didn't have, or start arguments about things that didn't matter. She had no shame about being lazy and selfish, and she seemed to take genuine pleasure in making Al's already miserable life even worse. Their children, Kelly and Bud, were just as far from typical TV kids as their parents were from typical TV adults. Kelly was the older child, a teenage girl who was beautiful but not particularly intelligent. The show constantly made jokes about her lack of intelligence, often having her say things that were completely nonsensical or showing her failing to understand basic concepts that most people would find simple. She was obsessed with her appearance, spent hours getting ready for dates, and cared more about looking good than about school, work, or helping her family. Her younger brother Bud thought he was much smarter than everyone else in the family, and he probably was. But that didn't make him any more likable. He was awkward, unpopular, and especially unsuccessful with girls his age. He spent most of his time making sarcastic comments about his family members and trying to prove how much more intelligent and sophisticated he was than everyone around him. Both children were completely selfish and only cared about themselves, just like their parents. The show made it clear from the very first episode that this was not going to be like other family comedies. There were no heartwarming moments where family members learned to appreciate each other. There were no valuable life lessons about the importance of love and communication. Instead, there were crude jokes about every topic you could imagine, including things that other shows would never dare to mention on television. The Bundys insulted each other constantly and seemed to genuinely dislike spending time together. They made fun of each other's appearances, intelligence, and personal failures without any concern for hurt feelings. Al would come home from work and immediately start complaining about his customers, his boss, his lack of money, and his disappointment with his family. Peg would ignore his problems and focus entirely on her own wants and desires. The kids would mock their parents and fight with each other over trivial things. But here's what made the show so popular with millions of viewers. Despite being exaggerated and over the top, the Bundys felt more realistic than all those perfect TV families that had come before them. They dealt with problems that real families actually faced. They struggled with money, which was something most American families could relate to. They were frustrated with their jobs and disappointed with how their lives had turned out. Their marriage wasn't romantic or exciting, but rather filled with resentment and boredom that had built up over years of living together. For many Americans, especially working-class families who felt ignored by most television programming, the Bundys represented something honest and authentic. Al's complaints about his terrible job and his memories of high school glory days resonated with viewers who felt trapped in their own unsatisfying careers. Peg's refusal to be a traditional housewife felt rebellious and funny to women who were tired of being expected to be perfect wives and mothers. Even the children's selfishness was entertaining because it reflected how teenagers actually behaved rather than how TV shows pretended they should behave. The show became incredibly popular almost immediately, but all the success came with a serious price. From the very beginning, Married with Children was surrounded by intense controversy. Television critics hated it and wrote scathing reviews calling it crude, offensive, and irresponsible. Religious groups organized protests and petition drives demanding that it be taken off the air. Conservative politicians used it as an example of everything that was wrong with American culture and blamed it for contributing to the decline of traditional family values. Parent groups worried that the show would be a bad influence on children and teenagers who might watch it and think that the Bundys' behavior was acceptable or funny. They argued that television should show positive role models and teach valuable lessons, not celebrate dysfunction and selfishness. The controversy grew so intense that it became a regular topic on television news programs, with reporters interviewing both supporters and critics of the show. Network television censors had never dealt with anything quite like Married with Children before. Every single week, the writers would create scripts that pushed boundaries and tested the limits of what was acceptable for broadcast television. The censors would carefully review each episode, looking for content that might be too offensive, inappropriate, or legally problematic. Sometimes they would demand that certain jokes be rewritten, specific scenes be removed, or particular lines of dialogue be changed. It became a constant battle between the creative team, who wanted to be as outrageous and controversial as possible, and the network executives, who were terrified of lawsuits, advertiser boycotts, and public relations disasters. Every week, scripts would go back and forth between the writers and the censors, with negotiations over what could stay and what had to be changed. But there was an unspoken understanding that everyone involved was aware of, even though nobody talked about it openly. The show could make dirty jokes, use sexual innuendo, and mock traditional values. But if they ever went too far into territory that made audiences genuinely uncomfortable rather than just shocked or amused, the network would shut them down completely. There was an invisible line that they could push right up against. But if they actually crossed it, there would be serious consequences that could end the show forever. The writers and producers thought they understood exactly where this invisible line was located. They had been creating episodes for 3 seasons without any catastrophic disasters. Sure, there had been complaints, protests, and negative publicity, but the show was still on the air, still getting high ratings, and still making lots of money for the network. They felt confident that they knew precisely how far they could push things without getting into real trouble. Then came the episode that would prove them completely wrong. It was called I'll See You in Court, and it seemed like just another typical Married with Children story when the writers first created it during the show's 3rd season in 1989. To everyone working on the production, this appeared to be just another day at the office. The actors learned their lines, the directors planned their shots, the crew set up the lighting and cameras, and everyone filmed the episode just like they had done dozens of times before. Nobody on the set had any idea that they were creating the most controversial and soon-to-be banned episode in the show's entire history. The cast and crew wrapped filming and went home, thinking they had completed just another outrageous but harmless installment of their popular sitcom. They had no clue that within days, network executives would be in complete panic mode, emergency meetings would be held behind closed doors, and their episode would disappear forever. The plot of I'll See You in Court started out seeming like a typical Bundy family adventure. Al and Peg's marriage had become even more boring and routine than usual. They barely spoke to each other anymore, and their romantic life had essentially disappeared completely. Desperate to bring some excitement back into their relationship, they decided to go to a cheap motel for what they hoped would be a romantic getaway that might help save their failing marriage. The motel they chose was exactly the kind of rundown, sleazy establishment that the Bundys would end up at, given their limited budget and low standards. It was the type of place that should probably have been condemned years ago, with stained carpets, broken furniture, and suspicious stains on the walls. But it was all they could afford, and they were so desperate to try anything that might help their relationship that they were willing to overlook its obvious problems. What Al and Peg didn't know was that this particular motel had a dark and illegal secret. The owners had secretly installed hidden cameras throughout the guest rooms. These cameras were recording visitors during their most private and intimate moments without their knowledge or consent. The recordings were being stored and possibly distributed to other people, which was not only a terrible violation of privacy, but also completely illegal. When Al and Peg checked into their room, they had no idea that their most personal moments were being recorded by strangers who had no right to see them. They thought they were finally getting some privacy away from their children and their everyday problems, but instead, they were being exploited in one of the worst ways imaginable. Eventually, the Bundys discovered what had happened to them. They learned that their private time together had been filmed without their permission, and that the recording had been viewed by other people. They were humiliated, angry, and felt completely violated by this invasion of their privacy. In typical Bundy fashion, they decided to fight back by taking the motel owners to court and suing them for invasion of privacy and emotional damages. But this being a Married with Children episode, nothing could go smoothly or work out the way it was supposed to. When Al and Peg arrived at court for their lawsuit, they discovered that they weren't the only victims of this terrible crime. Their neighbors, Steve and Marcy Rhodes, had also been to the same motel and had also been secretly recorded without their knowledge. What should have been a serious legal proceeding about privacy rights and consent turned into a complete circus of embarrassing testimony, crude jokes, and humiliating revelations about everyone involved. The courtroom scenes were filled with graphic and uncomfortable moments that made even devoted fans of the show cringe while watching. Instead of focusing on the serious crime that had been committed against innocent victims, the episode turned their humiliation and violation into entertainment and comedy. The jokes were so explicit and awkward that they pushed way beyond the boundaries of what most people consider acceptable, even for a show that was already known for being outrageous. The writers had created something that crossed the invisible line they had been dancing around for 3 seasons, and they were about to discover that there were consequences for going too far. On the surface, this plot might have seemed like typical Married with Children material. After all, the show had always made jokes about Al and Peg's terrible marriage and their complete lack of romance. The writers had tackled inappropriate subjects many times before and had always managed to get away with it. So what made this particular episode different? Why did it terrify network executives so much that they decided to bury it completely? The answer has everything to do with the timing of when this episode was created and the cultural war that was raging around the show at that exact moment. By 1989, Married with Children had already made some very powerful enemies who were determined to get it canceled. The show's biggest and most dangerous enemy turned out to be an ordinary housewife from Michigan named Terry Rakolta. Terry Rakolta was a mother of 4 children who had never intended to become famous or start a national controversy. She was just a regular person who happened to see an episode of Married with Children one evening while her kids were in the room watching television. The episode she saw wasn't even I'll See You in Court, but rather a different installment that featured the show's usual mixture of sexual jokes, crude humor, and inappropriate behavior. But what Terry Rakolta witnessed on her television screen that night shocked and horrified her beyond belief. She felt like the show was a direct attack on everything she believed in, about family values, moral behavior, and appropriate entertainment. She was convinced that Married with Children was corrupting the minds of children and teenagers who might watch it and think that the Bundys' behavior was acceptable or funny. Most people who strongly dislike a television show simply change the channel and forget about it. But Terry Rakolta didn't just change the channel. She declared an all-out war against Married with Children and everything it represented. She wasn't satisfied with just complaining to her friends and neighbors. She was determined to get the show completely canceled and removed from television forever. Rakolta began her campaign by writing passionate, well-crafted letters to every major corporation that advertised during Married with Children. She urged them to immediately stop sponsoring the show and pull all of their commercials. She told these companies that by advertising during the show, they were supporting and encouraging content that was harmful to families and children across America. Her letters were so compelling and persuasive that they started to have an impact that nobody had expected. To everyone's complete surprise, Terry Rakolta's grassroots campaign actually began to work. Some of the biggest and most respected corporations in America, including household names like Kellogg Cereal and Coca-Cola, made a decision to stop advertising during Married with Children. These companies were afraid of being associated with controversial content that might damage their family-friendly reputations and hurt their sales. The boycott campaign that had started with one angry mother writing letters from her kitchen table quickly grew into a national movement that was being covered by television news programs across the country. Reporters interviewed Terry Rakolta about her crusade against the show, and she became a celebrity spokesperson for traditional family values. Conservative politicians and religious leaders praised her efforts and encouraged other concerned parents to join her campaign. What had begun as personal outrage from a single viewer had somehow transformed into a cultural movement that was seriously threatening the existence of one of television's most popular shows. For the first time since it premiered, Married with Children was facing the real possibility of being canceled not because of low ratings, but because of organized public pressure. For Fox network executives, this situation was an absolute nightmare. The network was still relatively new and was desperately trying to establish itself as a legitimate competitor to ABC, NBC, and CBS, which had dominated television for decades. Fox had built its entire identity around being bold, fresh, rebellious, and willing to take risks that other networks wouldn't dare to take. Shows like Married with Children were essential to the strategy because they attracted attention and brought in viewers who were tired of the safe, predictable programming offered by the older networks. But Fox also desperately needed advertising revenue to stay in business and continue growing. When major corporations started pulling their advertising dollars because of Terry Ricalta's boycott campaign, the network found itself caught in an impossible situation. They had spent years promoting themselves as the edgy, dangerous network that wasn't afraid to push boundaries and challenge conventional wisdom. But now that edginess was costing them serious money, and executives were beginning to panic about the long-term survival of the network. This was exactly the worst possible moment for I'll See You in Court to land on the desks of Fox executives. Here was an episode with a plot that centered around people being secretly recorded during intimate moments without their consent, followed by a courtroom comedy that made light of privacy violations and sexual exploitation. It was precisely the kind of content that was already making advertisers nervous and giving ammunition to critics like Terry Ricalta, who were trying to get the show canceled. The timing couldn't have been worse. I'll See You in Court had already been filmed and was scheduled to air right in the middle of the boycott controversy. Every script was now being examined with a magnifying glass by nervous executives who were terrified of making the situation worse. The question was no longer whether an episode would be funny or entertaining, but whether it would cause another sponsor to pull out or generate more negative publicity for the network. The legal implications of the episode's plot made Fox executives even more uncomfortable. The story involved non-consensual filming of intimate moments, which raised serious questions about privacy rights, sexual exploitation, and consent. Even though the episode was clearly meant to be comedy rather than a realistic legal drama, the subject matter was too close to real-world issues that could potentially result in lawsuits or regulatory problems for the network. So Fox made a quiet but decisive decision. Without any public announcement or official statement, they simply pulled I'll See You in Court from the broadcast schedule. The episode that had been completed, edited, and ready to air suddenly vanished as if it had never existed at all. The cast and crew of Married with Children were completely baffled by what had happened. To them, I'll See You in Court had seemed like just another episode in a long series of outrageous installments. They had rehearsed the scenes, filmed the courtroom sequences, shot the motel storyline, and wrapped production just like they always did. Nobody on the set had any indication that they were creating something that would be considered too controversial even for their already controversial show. Ed O'Neill, who played Al Bundy, later said in interviews that he never understood why this particular episode was the one that got censored. After all, he had spent 3 seasons delivering monologues about inappropriate topics, making crude jokes about sensitive subjects, and saying things that other television shows would never dare to broadcast. Yet none of those previous moments had ever caused a network to panic and pull an entire episode. Katie Sagal, who played Peg Bundy, reportedly found the script funny and clever. From her perspective, the story of Al and Peg accidentally becoming unwilling stars of an unauthorized recording was perfectly consistent with the show's style of awkward, embarrassing, over-the-top comedy. She felt that the plot captured everything that made their fictional marriage so dysfunctional and ridiculous, which was exactly what the show was supposed to do. The episode's writers were equally shocked that their work had been deemed too controversial to air. Michael Moy, one of the show's co-creators, later revealed that I'll See You in Court had gone through all the normal pre-production approval processes without generating any red flags or warnings from the censors. It was only after Terry Ricalta's boycott campaign gained national attention that Fox began second-guessing every script and treating each episode as a potential public relations disaster. Some members of the crew even joked that the episode had become like a Bundy-Bermuda Triangle, something that had been filmed and completed but had mysteriously disappeared without any logical explanation. It wasn't just shelved or delayed. It was completely erased from the show's official history. For years afterward, fans and even people who had worked on the show began to wonder if the episode had been destroyed or if it had only been aired in other countries. The truth was actually stranger than any of the rumors. I'll See You in Court hadn't been destroyed at all. It was sitting complete and intact in a storage vault, ready to be broadcast at any time. But Fox had made the strategic decision to simply pretend it didn't exist. It was deliberately excluded from rerun packages, home video releases, and syndication deals sold to other networks. Among the people who worked on the episode, there remained a quiet belief that it would eventually be seen by audiences. One anonymous production assistant later told a television documentary, "We knew it would surface again someday. It was too good not to, too bold." As it turned out, they were absolutely right. For more than a decade, "I'll See You in Court" existed only as a whisper among dedicated married with children fans. It became an urban legend passed between viewers who had heard rumors about a mysterious missing episode, but could never find any proof that it actually existed. The episode wasn't included in any official DVD box sets, wasn't mentioned in episode guides, and wasn't part of the rerun marathons that aired on cable television. To newer fans who discovered the show years after it originally aired, the banned episode was like a ghost story. If you hadn't been watching closely during the original broadcast run, you would never know it had ever existed. But longtime fans kept the legend alive, sharing stories and theories about what the episode might have contained and why it had been censored. Then, in 2002, something unexpected happened that changed everything. FX, a cable channel that had acquired the rights to broadcast old Married with Children episodes, made a quiet decision that shocked longtime fans. Without any fanfare, special announcement, or publicity campaign, they simply included "I'll See You in Court" in their regular rotation of reruns. During a routine weekday afternoon broadcast, longtime fans who happened to be watching suddenly saw something they'd been waiting over a decade to see. There on their television screens was a legendary banned episode, airing in its complete and censored form for the first time in American broadcast history. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Fans who had grown up hearing about this mythical lost episode couldn't believe what they were seeing. Social media was still in its early stages, but internet message boards and fan websites went crazy with excitement. People were frantically calling their friends, recording the episode on VHS tapes, and sharing their reactions online. The episode aired exactly as it had been originally created, with nothing censored, no scenes removed, and no lines of dialogue changed. It was a complete, raw, unedited version that had been too controversial for 1989, but was somehow acceptable for cable television in 2002. The response from viewers was mixed but intense. Longtime fans were thrilled to finally see the episode they had heard about for so many years. For them, it was everything they had hoped it would be, a perfect example of Married with Children, at its most outrageous and boundary-pushing. Other viewers were more uncomfortable with the content, finding that the themes of voyeurism, privacy violation, and sexual exploitation felt even more disturbing in the early 2000s than they might have in 1989. But regardless of whether people liked or disliked the actual content, virtually everyone agreed that the episode was historically significant. It represented a moment in television history when networks were willing to suppress content not because it was obscene or harmful, but because it made audiences think about uncomfortable truths regarding privacy, consent, and exploitation. FX never promoted the broadcast or issued any press releases explaining why they had decided to air the banned episode. However, its appearance on cable television signaled a gradual shift in censorship standards and cultural attitudes. Cable networks had more freedom than broadcast television and were already pushing boundaries with shows like The Sopranos, South Park, and other programs that dealt with controversial subjects. The episode only aired a few times on FX before disappearing again, this time due to programming changes and contract negotiations rather than censorship concerns. But those few broadcasts were enough to prove that the episode still existed and still had the power to generate intense discussion and debate. The brief return of "I'll See You in Court" rekindled interest in getting it officially released as part of the show's complete collection. Fans launched petition campaigns on early internet websites. Entertainment journalists wrote articles about the episode's significance, and cast members were constantly asked about it during interviews and reunion events. The episode had evolved from being just a curiosity into becoming a symbol of artistic censorship and the power that networks held over creative content. It represented questions about who gets to decide what audiences can see and how cultural standards change over time. Sony Pictures Television, which owned the distribution rights to Married with Children, found itself in a difficult position. They knew there was significant demand for the episode, but they were also concerned about potential legal and public relations problems that might come from officially releasing content that had been banned for controversial subject matter. These discussions continued for years without any resolution, as lawyers and executives debated whether disclaimers would be necessary, how international markets might react, and whether releasing the episode might generate unwanted negative publicity. The conversations dragged on for over 2 decades without any concrete action being taken. But then something fundamental changed in the entertainment world that made all of those old concerns seem outdated and irrelevant. The rise of streaming services like Netflix, Amazon Prime, Hulu, and HBO Max created a completely new landscape for television content that operated under very different rules than traditional broadcast networks. These streaming platforms began producing and distributing shows with graphic violence, explicit sexual content, and controversial themes that made I'll See You in Court look incredibly tame by comparison. Programs like Euphoria, The Boys, Ozark, and countless others featured storylines about surveillance, privacy violations, and sexual exploitation that were far more intense and realistic than anything Married with Children had ever attempted. More importantly, modern audiences had become much more sophisticated about these issues. Viewers in 2025 were well aware of problems like revenge porn, unauthorized intimate recordings, digital stalking, and privacy violations because these had become common real-world problems that affected millions of people. The themes that had made the episode feel dangerously controversial in 1989 were now the exact same themes that audiences dealt with in their everyday lives. Sony executives finally realized that they had been sitting on a piece of television history that deserved to be seen and understood in its proper cultural context. Rather than being ashamed of the episode's controversial content, they could now present it as a fascinating artifact that showed how far society had evolved in its understanding of privacy, consent, and exploitation. In 2025, Sony announced that I'll See You in Court would finally be officially released as a centerpiece of special collection called Too Hot for Prime Time, featuring banned, censored, and suppressed episodes from various classic television shows. But this wouldn't just be a simple re-release of the original episode. The new version will be completely remastered in high-definition video quality and will include special commentary tracks featuring surviving cast members and producers explaining the controversy surrounding the episode and sharing their memories of working on it. There would also be a documentary short exploring why the episode was pulled, how Terry Ricalta's boycott campaign influenced the early years of Fox Network, and what the cast really thought about having their work censored. The timing for this release couldn't be more perfect. Modern audiences aren't just curious about lost and banned media. They're absolutely obsessed with it. YouTube channels, podcast series, and entire websites are dedicated to uncovering suppressed films, never-aired television pilots, censored scenes, and lost episodes from popular shows. There has never been a bigger appetite for content that was once forbidden or hidden from public view. From a business perspective, the return of I'll See You in Court represents more than just nostalgia marketing. Sony isn't simply re-releasing an old episode. They're unearthing a piece of suppressed entertainment that has suddenly become culturally relevant and historically important. This allows the release to become part of larger societal conversations about censorship, consent, privacy rights, and media control while simultaneously satisfying fans who want to experience one of television's most notorious banned episodes. There's also no longer any concern about advertiser boycotts or pressure campaigns from moral watchdog groups. Streaming platforms operate under completely different business models than traditional broadcast television. Content can be sold directly to consumers without the need for commercial sponsors, network approval, or concern about organized protest campaigns. What might have caused a ratings catastrophe in 1989 can now go live with the simple click of a button. This time, I'll See You in Court won't be hidden away in afternoon reruns or quietly slipped into a programming schedule without announcement. It will be featured prominently as the main attraction of the Too Hot for Prime Time collection, with its own marketing campaign and media attention. But why does this 35-year-old episode still matter today? At first glance, I'll See You in Court might seem like nothing more than a relic from an outdated sitcom that relied on shock value and crude humor to get attention. The plot about secret recordings and courtroom comedy might appear to be just typical Married with Children material that happened to push slightly too far over the line of acceptable taste. But if you look deeper at what the episode was actually about, you'll find themes that are more relevant and urgent now than they were when it was first created. This episode wasn't banned simply for being inappropriate or offensive. It was suppressed because it touched on something much more significant and prophetic about the direction our society was heading. At its core, I'll See You in Court was about consent, surveillance, privacy, and shame. In our current culture, where we're still trying to figure out who gets to control their own image, their personal information, and their private stories, those themes haven't aged at all. If anything, they become more important and more urgent than ever before. Think about what happens in an episode. The Bundys are secretly recorded during private, intimate moments without their knowledge or permission. The footage is stored and potentially distributed to other people. When they try to seek justice and hold someone accountable for violating their privacy, they're met with mockery, disbelief, and a legal system that seems more interested in entertainment than in protecting victims. Does that scenario sound familiar? It should, because it's exactly the same pattern we see in modern privacy scandals and digital exploitation cases. From hacked celebrity photos to revenge porn websites, from leaked personal videos to unauthorized intimate recordings, the past decade has shown us how easily private moments can become public humiliation. The victims of these violations are often blamed for what happened to them, laughed at by people who should be sympathetic, and told that they should have been more careful or should have known better. Real trauma gets turned into internet memes, social media jokes, and gossip entertainment. The justice system often fails to protect people whose privacy has been violated, and the legal process can become almost as humiliating as the original crime. I'll See You in Court may have presented these issues through the lens of crude comedy, but the underlying discomfort and violation were always there beneath the surface. Watching Al and Peg, characters who were famous for their lack of intimacy and romance, suddenly become unwilling victims of voyeurism highlighted just how vulnerable anyone can be when their privacy is invaded and their personal boundaries are crossed. The episode's humor didn't minimize the reality of what had happened to them. Instead, it exposed and emphasized the violation in a way that was impossible to ignore. The laughter didn't erase the crime. It made the exploitation more visible and uncomfortable for viewers to witness. That's exactly why network executives were so terrified of this episode in 1989. It wasn't just dirty or inappropriate. It was dangerous because it revealed uncomfortable truths about privacy, exploitation, and power. Not through a serious documentary or dramatic presentation, but through the kind of sharp, brutal comedy that hits you in the stomach when it's working at maximum effectiveness. The episode mocked a justice system that fails to protect vulnerable people from exploitation. It satirized a tendency for intimate violations to become public spectacle and entertainment. Most importantly, it showed how easily people can be humiliated and degraded when those who hold power treat their trauma as nothing more than a source of amusement. Today, we're finally ready to have that conversation. With smartphones in everyone's pockets, social media platforms that never forget anything, and surveillance technology that tracks our every move, almost no one can escape the possibility of having their private moments recorded and shared without their consent. The Bundys might never have imagined TikTok videos, Instagram stories, or leaked private messages, but their story asks a question that's more important now than ever. What happens when even the most powerless, disrespected people in society are exploited and violated, and nobody in authority seems to care? I'll See You in Court also serves as a powerful reminder about the dangers of censorship and the importance of protecting artistic expression, even when that expression makes us uncomfortable. The networks didn't ban this episode because it was harmful or dangerous to viewers. They banned it because they were afraid of public backlash, advertiser boycotts, and damage to their corporate reputation. In the 1980s, it was relatively easy for powerful institutions to bury uncomfortable stories and suppress challenging content. A network could simply decide not to air something, and most people would never know it had ever existed. Today, that kind of comprehensive censorship is much more difficult to maintain, thanks to social media, file sharing, and global connectivity that makes information much harder to suppress permanently. But the temptation to silence uncomfortable voices and challenging content is still there, and I'll See You in Court reminds us why we should resist that impulse. The episode that was once considered too shocking for television now feels like essential viewing for understanding how censorship works, why it's dangerous, and how cultural attitudes evolve over time. When you watch I'll See You in Court today, you're not just seeing a lost episode of a popular.